I don't blame them, poor fellas. Probably their god of evil.
It is a war.
Picture this. It's a Friday night in the fall of 1964. The kids are gathered around the TV, and something comes on that nobody has ever seen before in animation. Not a cartoon about funny animals, not a gag-a-minute comedy, but a full-blown action adventure with gunfights, monsters, jetpacks, and exotic locations around the globe. Parents sat down next to their kids and didn't get up. That was the power of Jonny Quest. And yet, in less than 6 months, it was gone. This is the story of how Jonny Quest, 1964, the 60s cartoon smash hit fell apart. The man who built it overnight. Long before the show had a name, it started with a man named Doug Wildey, a comic book artist from Yonkers, New York, who had done military service in Hawaii during World War II and spent the years after freelancing through magazines and comics. By 1962, he was working at Cambria Productions on a low-budget animated series called Space Angel, learning the ropes of television animation under artist Alex Toth. When that work dried up, Wildey wandered across the street to the Hanna-Barbera lot in Los Angeles, introduced himself, and mentioned that some people there had already come across his comic strips. It wasn't much of a pitch, but it worked. Joe Barbera called him in almost immediately and asked if he could design a cartoon series based on a classic radio adventure serial, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy. Wildey said yes and threw himself into it for about 3 months. He pored over copies of Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, and Science Digest, trying to figure out what the world might look like 10 years down the road. He sketched out a snow skimmer, a vehicle that would skim across snow the way a hovercraft moved over water, and designed hydrofoils and futuristic gadgets that hadn't yet become commonplace. He wrote dialogue, put together storyboards, and auditioned voice actors. The pitch was thorough, it was vivid, and then the whole thing fell apart before it even started, because Hanna-Barbera could not nail down the rights to the Jack Armstrong character.
Someone is coming.
Can you see who it is?
No, but I'm ready for him.
Rather than throw away 3 months of work, Barbera simply asked Wildey to start over with an original concept. Wildey went home that same night and wrote what would become Jonny Quest. He later said it wasn't that tough. He pulled from the adventure serials and films he grew up with, Jackie Cooper movies, Frankie Darro pictures, and from Milton Caniff's landmark newspaper comic strip, Terry and the Pirates, which had long set the gold standard for cinematic adventure storytelling in print. Barbera had also recently seen the first James Bond film, Dr. No, and wanted some of that spy thriller energy folded in. The result was a show about an 11-year-old boy, his globe-trotting scientist father, a government bodyguard, and a young friend from India, traveling the world and running headlong into scientific mysteries, international villains, and things that had no easy explanation. Wildey picked the name Quest out of the Los Angeles phone book because, as he put it, it simply sounded right and implied adventure. Joe Barbera suggested spelling the boy's name Johnny without the second H. So it was Jonathan, but never quite. The bodyguard got his name from 2 comic strips Wildey had tried and failed to sell years earlier. One featured a character called Stretch Bannon, the other a world-traveling writer named Race Dunhill. He put Race and Bannon together and kept going. The show had a working title for a while, The Saga of Chip Ballou, which Wildey himself admitted was never a serious contender. For a time, it was also called Quest File 037, a nod to Barbera's enthusiasm for the Bond franchise. Eventually, it became simply Jonny Quest. The promotional reel, the film used to sell the show to ABC and to advertisers, included footage from the old Jack Armstrong pilot that had never gone anywhere. The hovercraft sequence in the closing credits, where two men flee from spear-throwing natives and escape in an airship, came entirely from that earlier project. It had nothing to do with the new series, but it looked exciting, and that was the point. According to Barbera, when they screened the promotional reel for advertisers, it blew them right out of the room. ABC picked up the show for Friday nights in prime time, an almost unheard of slot for an animated series at that point. The Flintstones had done it first, but beyond that, cartoons simply weren't considered evening entertainment. Jonny Quest premiered on ABC at 7:30 p.m. on Friday, September 18, 1964.
Bye. Do not go, senores. He's very bad for us. Sorry, Montoya.
What made it different? Hanna-Barbera had built its reputation on limited animation, a technique that kept costs manageable by reusing movement cycles, keeping backgrounds simple, and relying on voice performances and music to carry the weight. Shows like The Flintstones and The Jetsons were funny and lovable, but they weren't exactly trying to look like moving paintings. Jonny Quest was something else entirely. Doug Wildey wanted what he called a moving comic strip. He brought the heavy blacks and shadows of his print work into the animation, giving characters a sense of weight and dimension that was uncommon for TV cartoons of the era. The backgrounds were detailed and specific. The Sargasso Sea, the Amazon jungle, the Arctic, the streets of Calcutta. The characters looked like people, not caricatures. They moved through real-seeming space. The show was also unusual for its choice of storytelling material. Each episode was a self-contained adventure, but the threats were often genuinely dangerous. Men died on screen. Villains weren't bumbling incompetence. They were calculating, sometimes brutal, occasionally terrifying. There were episodes involving invisible energy monsters, ancient mummies brought back to something resembling life, and a creature in the sea that still holds up as one of the more unsettling things ever put in a children's cartoon. The main cast was small and deliberately chosen. Jonny Quest was 11 years old, voiced by Tim Matheson, and was the kind of kid who could handle a scuba tank, a firearm, and a judo throw without making it feel implausible. His father, Dr. Benton Quest, was one of the top scientists in the world, a single parent raising his son on the edge of the unknown, voiced for most of the series by Don Messick. Race Bannon, voiced by Mike Road, was the bodyguard assigned by a government intelligence agency to protect the Quest family, and his design was modeled on actor Jeff Chandler, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, entirely unafraid of anything.
Ugala must be native for stroke.
Haji, voiced by Danny Bravo, was an 11-year-old orphan from Calcutta who had saved Dr. Quest's life and was subsequently adopted into the family. Bandit, the small white dog with black markings around his eyes, rounded out the group and was, incidentally, not Doug Wildey's idea. Wildey had wanted a monkey. Hanna-Barbera overruled him. The music was equally distinctive. Composer Hoyt Curtin wrote a driving, jazz-influenced score heavy on percussion, nothing like the cheerful orchestral pop that accompanied most cartoons at the time. The opening theme alone was enough to put a kid on the edge of their seat. This wasn't a cartoon that talked down to its audience. The science was grounded enough in real-world 1960s thinking to feel plausible. The locations were researched. The action had consequences. And because it aired in prime time and had a budget to match, it could deliver on its ambitions in ways that Saturday morning programming simply couldn't. There was also something quietly radical about the family at the center of it. Dr. Quest was a widower. Johnny's mother, never mentioned by name, simply gone. That gave the show a melancholy undercurrent that most cartoons wouldn't touch. These weren't a perfect nuclear family bouncing through harmless situations. They were people doing their best in a world that was often genuinely hostile. The show trusted its audience to sit with that, and the audience responded. the international settings deserved credit too. Jonny Quest didn't stay in an American suburb or a generic cityscape. In a single season, the show moved across Egypt, the Caribbean, the Himalayas, Mexico, the Florida Everglades, and the waters of the Sargasso Sea, each time making a genuine effort to give those places their own look and feel on screen. For kids in 1964 who had never traveled anywhere, it was a window into the wider world dressed up as adventure television. Wildey himself acknowledged the limitations of working inside a large studio. He was clear in later interviews that he couldn't control every aspect of a production running at that scale. With a full studio of artists and animators working across two major shows simultaneously, there were corners cut, inconsistencies, moments where the animation didn't quite match what he'd envisioned. But the bones of the thing were solid.
Them poor fellas. Probably they're god of evil.
It is a warning.
Warning?
See?
The numbers didn't lie, but neither did the bills. For a show that was canceled after a single season, Jonny Quest performed remarkably well. Critics responded positively almost from the start. Ratings were strong. Families watched together. In an era when television was still largely a communal activity, one set per household, everyone in the same room, that meant the show was reaching across generations in a way that mattered to advertisers. There was one problem, and it was insurmountable. The show cost too much to make. Hanna-Barbera had built its business model on economical production. The studio's whole philosophy was about doing more with less, finding ways to get a finished product on screen without spending what the major theatrical studios spent. Jonny Quest broke that model. Each episode reportedly cost somewhere in the range of $50,000 to $60,000, a significant figure for television animation in 1964. The detailed backgrounds, the more realistic character movement, the richer music, all of it added up in ways that couldn't easily be trimmed.
And so do the crocs.
Faster, friend, faster!
After 26 episodes, running from September 18, 1964 to March 11, 1965, the show was canceled. Not because it failed, because it succeeded at something the studio couldn't afford to keep doing. There was also the matter of the moral watchdog groups beginning to circle. In 1965, the National Association for Better Radio and Television, an advocacy group sometimes called NAFBRAT, released an assessment of network programming that listed Jonny Quest as objectionable, labeling it shoddy for its violence and content. Their recommended viewing list was widely mocked. Time magazine noted that NAFBRAT's preferred programming had a collective depth of just over 3/16 of an inch. The criticism didn't land with much force at the time, but it pointed toward a larger cultural shift that would grow louder over the next several years. The show had aired on a Friday night in prime time, explicitly because its level of action and violence put it outside the traditional children's viewing hour. The whole point was that it wasn't just for kids, but the pressure to define children's content more narrowly and to make it safer, softer, and less challenging was already building. When Jonny Quest left ABC in the spring of 1965, it didn't vanish. It went into reruns, and that's where the real story began.
Did this to you.
I don't think you're getting through to him.
We are friends.
The long life of reruns. Most television shows, when they're canceled, disappear. Jonny Quest did the opposite. It moved to CBS beginning in September 1967, running Saturday mornings and early afternoons for 3 years. Then it moved to NBC, airing there from September 1971 to September 1972. That made it one of a very small number of American television series to have aired on all 3 of the major broadcast networks, something it shares with the Jetsons and almost nothing else. For a full 2 decades after it was canceled, Jonny Quest was in front of audiences somewhere. Kids who were born years after the original run grew up with it anyway. The Saturday morning cartoon blocks of the 1970s and early 1980s were filled with Hanna-Barbera programming, and Jonny Quest kept cycling through. What's worth noting is how little the show aged, at least visually. The 1970s brought a wave of new Hanna-Barbera cartoons built on the same limited animation principles, but with even less investment in detail. Bright, flat, breezy things that were fine for filling a Saturday morning, but didn't linger. Against that backdrop, the original Jonny Quest episodes looked almost startlingly good. The shadows were still there, the weight was still there, the villains were still threatening.
We're not cooked yet, Emil. Not by a long shot.
A kid flipping channels on a Saturday in 1975 who landed on Jonny Quest was landing somewhere different from everything else around it. The show accumulated its real fan base during this period. Children who caught it in reruns didn't know and often didn't care that it was old. It didn't look or feel like the cartoons being made around them. It had a different energy, a different visual language, a different weight. It felt like something imported from another world, which, in a sense, it was. It was a primetime adventure series from 1964, and nothing on Saturday morning in 1974 or 1978 was trying to do what it had done. In that long stretch of syndication, the show also picked up something it hadn't quite had during its original run, a reputation as a classic. Doug Wildey, who had spent years watching the show he created, received minimal recognition, while Hanna-Barbera collected the profits and the credit, was eventually able to speak about it publicly in a 1986 interview that has been preserved by Jonny Quest fan communities. He talked about the creation process in detail, about the Jack Armstrong origins, about the battle over his created by credit, a credit the studio had initially refused to give him, before they finally settled on based on an idea created by, which was the version that appeared on screen. His frustration was quiet but clear. The show had been his vision. The realistic art style, the specific character designs, the tone, those came from him. But inside the Hanna-Barbera system, creators didn't carry the weight that studios did.
Sorry, Captain. Oh, come on, Bandit. Please say you forgive us.
The revival that couldn't catch the original. By the mid-1980s, interest in a new version of Jonny Quest was genuine and growing. Since 1984, Hanna-Barbera had reportedly been approached by 6 different companies wanting to license the property for a live-action primetime series, for a feature film, for various other formats. The studio turned all of them down. What it decided to do instead was produce new episodes itself, pairing them with reruns of the original in its syndicated programming block, The Funtastic World of Hanna-Barbera. The block was being expanded from 90 minutes to 2 hours, and a half-hour adventure segment was needed. 13 new episodes were produced, premiering in September 1986. The idea, if the new episodes performed well, was to eventually commission another 26 episodes, which, combined with the original 26, would bring the total to 65. 65 episodes was the magic number for syndication packages at the time. It never happened. The 1986 series kept the core premise intact. Dr. Quest, Race Bannon, Jonny, Haji, and Bandit traveling the world and confronting danger.
Fade ahead, the fabled lost city of Malatan, built by a lost civilization.
Don Messick returned to voice Dr. Quest and Bandit, and Vic Perrin returned as the villain, Dr. Zinn. But most of the original voice cast had moved on. Scott Menville took over as Jonny, Rob Paulson voiced Haji, and Granville Van Dusen played Race Bannon. The tone, however, was noticeably different. The new episodes were deliberately softened, less violent, more family-friendly, more cautious about the kind of content that had defined the original. The adventures were there, but the edge was gone. A new character, an ancient stone warrior named Hard Rock, was introduced and appeared in 5 of the 13 episodes, an addition that struck many longtime fans as a strange fit for a series that had prided itself on grounded, quasi-realistic storytelling. The show also suffered from limited visibility. The fantastic world of Hanna-Barbera was a syndicated package, which meant its distribution was uneven. Not every local station carried it, and those that did often aired it inconsistently. Many people who had grown up with the original simply didn't know the new episodes existed. Unlike the later revivals, there was no major marketing push, no fast food tie-ins, no coordinated launch across multiple platforms. Only 13 episodes were made. No further order came. The 1986 run quietly ended. The 1990s and the slow fade. A decade later, there was one more serious attempt, the most ambitious since the original. The Real Adventures of Jonny Quest premiered on August 26, 1996, on Cartoon Network. Turner Broadcasting had acquired Hanna-Barbera in 1991, and the company was eager to build original content for its cable channels. Jonny Quest seemed like a natural property to revive. The new series was conceived in the early 1990s, and from the beginning, it had trouble. Production issues were documented as early as January 1995. The original creator, Peter Lawrence, was removed in 1996 along with character designer Takashi, and a new team was brought in to finish the first 26 episodes. A second team ultimately produced 26 more. The show ran for a total of 52 episodes before it was canceled. The Real Adventures updated the characters significantly. Johnny was now 14. Haji was the same age. A new character, Jessie Bannon, Race's daughter, joined the team and appeared in every episode. The adventures took place both in the physical world and in a virtual reality environment called Quest World, rendered in early computer animation. Turner launched the show simultaneously on Cartoon Network, TBS, and TNT, airing 21 times per week at its peak. There were 33 merchandise licensees. It was a corporate push on a scale the property had never seen. And it still didn't work, not the way anyone had hoped. The merchandise performed poorly. The show attracted a devoted audience, but not the demographic numbers Turner needed. The 2 seasons of the show were produced by entirely different teams, with different voice casts and different approaches to the characters, which created an inconsistency that frustrated viewers who had been following from the start. Critics who loved the original were divided on whether the new version honored the spirit of the classic or diluted it beyond recognition. The show ended in April 1997 for new episodes, with reruns continuing on Toonami until September 1999 and sporadically after that. After that, the live-action film that had been discussed since the early 1990s continued to drift through development. Director Richard Donner had been attached. Robert Rodriguez was later involved. Dwayne Johnson and Zac Efron were mentioned for a version in development around 2009. Chris McKay was attached in 2018. As of now, no Jonny Quest film has been made.
He's at 90,000. Investigate. Well called.
What remained? What's left of Jonny Quest, after 60 years, is something that no subsequent version fully recaptured and no cancellation could erase. The original 26 episodes are still the measure of everything that came after them. They were made at enormous cost, killed by their own ambition, and then spent 20 years quietly making the show a classic in Saturday morning reruns that weren't even supposed to be the main event. An 11-year-old watching CBS in 1969 or NBC in 1972 didn't know they were watching a canceled show. They just knew it was unlike anything else on. Doug Wildey never got a created by credit on the show he created. He went home one night and wrote Jonny Quest, and the studio took it from there. He continued working in comics through the 1980s and early 1990s, returning to the property in print with Comico's Jonny Quest comic series that launched in 1986. He passed away on October 4th, 1994, before the real adventures ever aired. The Venture Brothers, which ran on Adult Swim from 2003 to 2021, built an entire satirical universe out of the Jonny Quest template, a loving and sharp-eyed deconstruction of everything the original represented and everything the culture around it couldn't quite say out loud. It may be the most sustained piece of Jonny Quest criticism ever made, and it was made by people who clearly loved the source material deeply. The original series is available on Blu-ray, released by Warner Archive Collection in 2019, and reruns began airing on MeTV Tunes in 2024. The theme music, composed by Hoyt Curtin, is still one of the most recognizable pieces of cartoon music ever written. What the show did in 1964, bringing serious adventure storytelling, genuinely dangerous stakes, and a cinematic visual language into American animation, was something the medium hadn't attempted before in that form, and wouldn't consistently attempt again for many years. It was expensive, it was ambitious, it was canceled before it should have been, and it became a classic because it deserved to. What the show did in 1964, bringing serious adventure storytelling, genuinely dangerous stakes, and a cinematic visual language into American animation, was something the medium hadn't attempted before in that form and wouldn't consistently attempt again for many years. It was expensive, it was ambitious, it was canceled before it should have been, and it became a classic because it deserved to. Part of what makes the story stick is how unfair it was, in a quiet, institutional kind of way. A man went home one evening, wrote something brilliant almost from scratch, and watched the system absorb it, file down its edges whenever it could, and still couldn't entirely ruin it. The show survived everything: cancellation, budget pressures, weak revivals, decades of corporate shuffling, because the original idea was that good. That's a story that doesn't happen very often. Jonny Quest ran for 26 episodes. 26, and in that single season, less than 6 months on the air, it still managed to shape animation, inspire generations of fans and creators, and refused to disappear no matter how many times the industry moved on from it. If you grew up with this show, whether in its original primetime run, in Saturday morning reruns, or in any of the revivals, you know exactly why it stuck around. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's a lot more history like this where that came from. Shows that were taken too soon, stories that got complicated, classics that deserve a closer look. We'll see you in the next one.